And this is the Oakland-Macomb Campaign for Liberty, drawing from both of these two great counties. So this is a great thing tonight. So tonight, we really have a tremendous meeting. This may be the greatest Campaign for Liberty event yet. And we'll be Skyping to Coleen Rowley, the former FBI special agent and former 9/11 whistleblower. She was the 2003 Time Magazine Co-Person of the Year for her work trying to get out the truth about what had happened in the lead up to 9/11 and that sort of thing. And she's been working on topics like that ever since then. Round of applause for the heroic former special agent in the FBI and 9/11 whistleblower and consistent defender and fighter for peace, for liberty, and privacy, Coleen Rowley. A big round of applause for Coleen. We've heard her before. She's the former co-person of the year with Time Magazine in 2003, and she graciously agreed to speak with us. And as I mentioned earlier, while we were offline, but at the beginning of the meeting, that she has met Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. She's met with Edward Snowden in Moscow, and she works with a great group. Remember Ray McGovern and of course, Coleen, and there's a whole bunch of folks in the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and we need some sanity right now. And Coleen, you mentioned last night about that piece that was coming up from the VIPs on Julian Assange and what's happening to him and some of the risks there. Would you please tell us about that and what some of your concerns are right now regarding Julian Assange?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me tonight. I think maybe the libertarians are perhaps the very best group in the country now to understand the issue.
Yay! A big round of applause for that. She truly is as brilliant as I said. Okay.
I wish there were more people that remembered freedom of press and freedom of speech, because that's what's at risk right now. I mean, we are going to watch this just completely evaporate if the powers that be have their way in they already have jailed someone for journalism, and now if they continue with the prosecution, the extradition hearing is tomorrow. The first extradition hearing is tomorrow. Julian Assange was sentenced to 50 weeks in prison for having not paid his bail when he was accused by Sweden, which seems to have been a set-up ruse thing. And the only one who Julian Assange was the one all those years that said, I can't go to Sweden. You can come here to interview me about those charges, those specious charges, but I won't go to Sweden because the United States is going to try to extradite me. All of those officials have called for my execution. They've all these things, and of course no one believed him, and it was always true. There was a long-standing secret grand jury that was looking at indicting and charging Assange, and the only problem they had, people say, why did it take so long? The problem they had was what they called the New York Times problem, which is that if you try to accuse someone of espionage for publishing news, as WikiLeaks did, you will then make the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, Chicago, all the main newspapers and media outlets in the country will realize that this could also hurt them. And so under the Obama administration, they didn't know what to do, and he was not indicted. So there's so many shenanigans in this case that I don't hardly know what to start with. But I'll just mention that I heard an attorney, a talking head on one of the mainstream news, say that Assange is both puzzling and polarizing. Puzzling and polarizing. That might have been the kindest epithet that I've heard, a kindest description I've heard. The rest of the news is calling him a cyberpunk, an activist, a rapist, a Russian agent. Almost none of them are calling him a journalist. And so this puzzling and polarizing to go with the polarizing, the reason that's not true now is that in our country, both the Republicans and the Democrats have a fully bipartisan agreement. They're in full agreement to try to prosecute Assange. I have only heard one candidate, maybe another one in a lesser way, but I really have only heard one Democratic candidate say that this is about going after journalists in order to make them toe the line and not reveal war crimes or embarrassing or illegal things that the government's doing. And that was Tulsi Gabbard. She was very strong on it. But the rest of the crowd, what, 20 some, they're all for it. And that's Republicans like the Trump administration, certainly, since they're the ones who went forward with this indictment. So it's not polarizing. No, the polarizing is not true. It's completely bipartisan now, and if anything, there's solid agreement. The one thing that the puzzling part, of course, I've met Assange 3 times, and he's not. When you talk with him, he's just a normal person. He is very smart. I would grant that. Maybe that's a little bit puzzling that he could have probably excelled and made a lot of money at doing all kinds of things because he's a very smart person. However, what might be puzzling is that he really has this devotion to the ethic of journalism, and very few. That would be puzzling to most journalists today, because most journalists are just going where the money is, and they're owned by 6 oligarchs, and they're just going to print what they're told to print or write what they're told to write. And there are very, very few journalists left that really are devoted to the ethic of journalism and basically exposing the wrongdoing of power. That's kind of what it was, and Assange was that way. That's puzzling to a lot of other people because they just can't even appreciate why someone would take these risks, and now possibly even martyrdom, might even be martyrdom. And I want to go into a couple more shenanigans here before I take some questions. So one of the shenanigans is the time, okay? But because there's a 5-year normal statute of limitations on both conspiracy and computer intrusion, computer fraud. Both of those normal crimes are 5 years. And so if you're not charged in 5 years, they can't charge you. There's a lot of reasons for having statute of limitations. Well, okay, the last conversation that they're using as this pretext to charge Assange, and by the way,
yes.
It'll be a grounds for argument, so we'll find out. The last conversation that is the crux of the accusation that Assange was helping Manning commit a computer intrusion, and this conversation, by the way, was basically how he could protect his identity, which is something that journalists would often do with a source. That is not out of the normal for a journalist to try to help a source keep their identity secret. And so this conversation they had, I think, was in about the spring of 2010. And that was the last conversation. And so a normal statute of limitations, you have to charge both conspiracy or computer fraud in 5 years. Now, the Obama administration decided that it would be too difficult, that they would also be going after mainstream newspapers, because the newspapers all published the WikiLeaks back then. And so they could not figure this out. The attorneys in the Obama administration tried very hard to figure out a way to legally charge Assange, but they couldn't in 5 years. And so when the Trump administration comes in, and Pompeo and others are just hell bent to ensure that they retaliate against Assange for the Manning, the WikiLeaks, of the war crimes of Iraq and the cables that were released. They had their attorneys come up with this unique thing where they extend the 5-year statute of limitations to 8 years. And this is through the Patriot Act and I think another terrorism law. So they made, if you're a terrorist, you have the benefit of an extra 3 years. The government has an extra 3 years to charge you if they charge you as a terrorist. And so Assange, in addition to being called a Russian agent, is also labeled as a terrorist for purpose of the indictment in order to extend the statute of limitations to 8 years. And I think if you look at the timeline, he was charged just days even before the 8 years would have run out. So that's one big shenanigan in this case. The other big shenanigan, of course, is the press itself. And this is what I think anybody who cares about liberty and freedom, and actually even cares about their public safety, because with whistleblowers, I was a whistleblower on public safety. I knew that if we didn't fix 9/11, all we're going to be doing is suffering more and more attacks, because they were lying about things. They came up with all false solutions that had nothing to do with what had caused 9/11, which is essentially a failure to share information and act on information. And they didn't want that. That was too embarrassing to tell the public. And so they came up with all this false stuff. Iraq is behind 9/11. We have to torture. We have to massively surveil all Americans. If we could have just had everyone under surveillance, we would have been able to prevent 9/11. All these lies. And so public safety is huge in this situation. I think if people understood that whistleblowing, like Daniel Ellsberg, when he went to the press, finally, he was trying before this and he couldn't get anyone to publish, and he couldn't get even Fulbright in the Congress, who was against the Vietnam War. He couldn't even get Fulbright to get enough courage to release these Pentagon Papers. However, when he finally got the Washington Post to do that, he got 18 papers back then to finally run the Pentagon Papers. And right now, if you look at the way the Assange and WikiLeaks is being covered, there is absolutely no ability to get any whistleblower who could know about even the most severe and grave threat to public safety, could go to the New York Times, the Washington Post, Chicago, LA, etc., and they're going to say, we don't want to hear it, get out of here. And that's the scary thing, and it's actually more than just fraud. We all think of whistleblowers as fraud and money. The taxpayers are losing a lot of money when nobody talks about how Boeing is running unsafe planes, or etc. All these things are matters usually of money. Actually, Boeing is a bad example. Boeing is also public safety. It's a huge public safety. So a lot of times they overlap. But it's a question right now of the freedom of press and freedom of speech, because every person needs to know information to protect themselves. If 9/11 itself had been shared, if all of the threats and all of the intelligence that had been coming in would have been shared with the public, it probably would not have happened, or it would not have happened to the extent it happened. It was because the public was in the dark about this. And the one plane that had 15 minutes of warning was able to avoid crashing into either the White House or the Congress. So that's the real big thing here. Freedom of press, freedom of speech helps protect our own safety as well as our money, our taxpayers' money, etc. Right now, John Pilger, I'm going to say there's about 5 op-eds that are really good to read. John Pilger is one. Jonathan Cook is another one. Allison Weir, WEIR. And our VIPS memo was put out today on Consortium News. Almost all of these editorial pieces are not in mainstream news. You won't find them anywhere. They're only really on Consortium News or Anti-War or some other places like that. And so those are really good ones to read. But I was trying to bring up some points about this that people don't appreciate. John Pilger said that there is a military document in the UK, like their Defense Department. So like the British Defense Department has a document that says there are 3 main threats to good public order. Good public order. And the 3 main threats to good public order are the Russians, terrorists, and investigative journalists. And of these three threats, the worst threat is investigative journalists. This is actually in an official Defense Department document in the UK. And, I don't know how they got a hold of it and found out, but this is the mentality right now, which is that they have to go after people. Certainly whistleblowers, are going to be prosecuted. Manning, this is another one of the shenanigans. Manning served 7 years. He was tortured and everything else. And he is being put back into prison so that they can force out of him some inculpatory thing on Assange. So this is like something that, the worst dictatorships in the world do, that we always thought, you imprison somebody in order to torture a confession out of them. We're supposed to have a Fifth Amendment that prevents this, etc. And that's another one of the shenanigans. And I'm just going to close here. I'm sure there are some people, I could talk a little longer about the hearing tomorrow that Assange will have, but I'll close and maybe you have some questions. I want to say that Russiagate, which I and other VIPs see as this big hoax, in a lot of ways had two really bad consequences. So Russiagate, of course, the Democrats think it's helping them. They're able to make this big circus in Congress today. They went after Attorney General Barr and tried to make it seem like one was stronger than the other. All the presidential candidates are leaping on this. So they think Russiagate is helping them politically. But there are two main and terrible consequences of Russiagate. One is the confrontation with nuclear-armed Russia right now, which has us on the most dangerous, if you listen to Stephen Cohen and others, we're on the most dangerous footing, way more dangerous than even during the Cold War, because at least during the Cold War, even JFK developed a hotline with Khrushchev, and of course Reagan, was able to work with Gorbachev. So you actually are in a more serious situation, more dangerous now. And you know what it's from? It's from Russiagate and this bipartisan demonization where the whole country has been led to believe that the Russians are attacking us, right out of the Nazi playbook. Just tell them they're being attacked. And when they tell us that we're being attacked, most people fall for it. So that's one bad thing. The other bad consequence is the fact right now that we're going to lose the First Amendment, freedom of press, and freedom of association, because Assange, being the good journalist he was, he now has made both parties mad. He made the Hillary people mad just more recently, and they hate him. And before this, he made the Republicans mad by releasing the Iraq War documents and war crimes, etc. So a good journalist doesn't take sides. A good journalist's ethics is probably, you're going to make everybody in power mad. And that's exactly what has happened to Assange. And so as a result of this, there are some wise newspapers. I looked right now, I found 10 op-eds or editorials in the papers. 5 or 6, over half of the editorials and op-eds are saying, prosecute him to the max. We don't care. It won't affect our journalism because he's a cyberpunk. He's a activist. He's a Russian agent. He's not a journalist. So half of them are in that mode. They don't care about freedom of press. The other half still call him every name in the book. They say they hate him. He's blah, blah, blah. But they come back and they finally say, however, if you prosecute Assange for these things that he did, these are normal journalism practices, and you will hurt the freedom of press. You're going to hurt us. And I have seen at least maybe 40, maybe 50% of the op-eds in that vein. No op-eds support Assange. At the very best they do is saying, we're going to go down, freedom of press is going to go down if you try to prosecute Assange. And so that's kind of, it's a big deal. I mean, even those op-eds are correct. It's just that they are so worried about actually taking a stronger stance and saying, what he did was truly good journalism. They were all accurate and authentic leak documents, and citizens need to know these things. I'm just going to plug my own op-ed from many years ago. I co-wrote with the FAA Red Team leader called WikiLeaks and 9/11, What If? I think that I printed it. I've reposted that a few times. WikiLeaks and 9/11, What If? Because if you don't have an outlet for anybody insider to, when they know that there is a serious risk to public safety, but the establishment officials are covering it up because they don't want to be embarrassed, there has to be an outlet for that. If there isn't, there will be no way that we can have democracy. We can't even be able to protect ourselves. And so I just want to close with that and see if there's any questions.
Any questions? Well, I don't see one yet, so I'll ask a quick one here. Oh, now we got Joel Thomas. Joel, come on down so we get you on camera and so Coleen can hear you. So here comes Joel Thomas. He's one of our young activists here in Southeast Michigan. Now, come on, I got to come up here, and then you can look at the camera and speak to the microphone, please.
I'm very tired. Hi. Do you think that if Assange is convicted, do you think that Trump will be able to pardon him?
He could. It's certainly any president down the line. If he's convicted, I have a feeling he would be convicted probably for life. Daniel Ellsberg was facing basically a life term. He would have maybe gotten out when he was 80 or something. So I think that Assange, they may well add to the indictment that already he's indicted for the Manning cyber the fraud, the computer fraud. If they are able, they may well tack on what the Mueller investigation says, which is that WikiLeaks was an agent of the Russians, etc. And so they may tack that on. And I think it would be a lengthy sentence if he's prosecuted in the United States. Presidents in the future could potentially pardon him, absolutely, if there is a mind change. And right now, the real problem in the United States is because we fall into these two parties, and both parties' leaders have this strong agreement that Assange is bad and that he was acting for the Russians in the case of Hillary, and he was acting to expose war crimes of the Republicans. And so they both are mad. They carry their followers with them. And most people, other than consortium news readers, there's Caitlin Johnstone, Jimmy Dore, there's a handful of voices right now who are kind of understand the situation. The rest of the American public doesn't. In the UK, two people that extradition was sought for hacking to the United States. In Britain, they denied that these people charged with hacking military, they hacked military things in the United States, and the U.S. sought extradition. And in both cases, the British government denied the extradition. In one case, it was Theresa May, and she did it based on health reasons in one case, because the hacker was autistic, and she thought that the guy would commit suicide, so she denied extradition. And the other time she denied extradition, let me see what the reason was. You know why? Public opinion. And so if there's a strong public opinion, the politicians will listen. And certainly in Great Britain, the politicians would listen if there was an outcry. And unfortunately, this is what our task is, to educate the public about how this will negatively affect themselves. Not only their newspapers, but even themselves in the sense of public safety. I think that if people understood the cost to themselves that they are incurring with this, what help. the rest, their fun day of prosecuting Julian Assange, because a lot of this is simply retaliation, and a lot of it is their need to control the media. They want to set an example. This is what Tulsi Gabbard said, and she's absolutely correct. They're trying to make an example so there will be no more whistleblowing and no more publishing like happened in the Pentagon Papers. And if people understand that, maybe there's a chance. But right now, we're at a disadvantage because these op-eds, you just look at the newspapers, these op-eds are forming public opinion in the opposite direction.
Okay, I think we have a question, maybe a couple of questions. Or actually, the young gentleman here, I think, was first. He has, and then we have a second question. Our friend Doug, but and come on up and tell Coleen about your T-shirt, sir. It's an excellent T-shirt.
Hi, Coleen. I'm sorry here. I've never heard of you before this, and I'll be sure to look up some of your work afterwards. But I'm a member of the Mises Caucus and the organizer in the state of Michigan, as well as the chairman, Libertarian Party, Oakland County. But as I'm sure you're well aware, Chelsea Manning has been imprisoned and spent some time again in solitary for the last 2 months, I believe. I am not fully informed on exactly what charges she is being brought up on and how are they not double jeopardy. Obviously, an egregious violation of her constitutional rights. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us again.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a stronger term than shenanigan, because I call these things shenanigans, and that this isn't, I need a much stronger term. Maybe someone can help me in the audience.
Atrocity.
What did you say?
Atrocity.
Atrocity. Yeah, it's an atrocity. She's not charged, but she is charged with contempt of grand jury. So the grand jury can call somebody to talk. This almost never happens. They almost never jail a witness who doesn't talk with the grand jury. If you go in, you say, I have I think she claimed the First Amendment. She asserted her First Amendment rights. And maybe something else, but I know she asserted her First Amendment rights. And usually, a lot of times, people assert their Fifth Amendment rights, and that's where it ends. That's where it ends. If the grand jury wants to, they can say, well, we won't. If that's a Fifth Amendment, they can say, well, okay, we won't. We already charged you with this crime, so you have immunity for this. You can't be prosecuted again. It'd be double jeopardy. But we still want you to talk. And if you won't talk, it's contempt of grand jury, and you go to jail. This grand jury is impaneled for 18 months. So, a witness held by a grand jury for 18 months, I think, is quite unusual. I know Judith Miller was held for like 30 days or something like that when she would not give up her source of Valerie Plame, who told her to put the story about Valerie Plame, and I think somebody else was too, maybe a couple of days. So there is some precedent for putting witnesses in jail when the grand jury holds them in contempt. But to be honest, 18 months is really long. And the other thing is, I think they could actually, theoretically, impanel another grand jury and continue to hold her in contempt with that grand jury. So this is seen as abusive, and I would hope that all of the people who are, were Manning supporters. A lot of people were Manning supporters when she did the 7 years, and she was tortured and everything else. And the problem is, a lot of people in the country now, especially the Democrats, who now hate WikiLeaks because they blame WikiLeaks for Hillary Clinton's loss. They were, there were amongst the people in that Democrat camp were some people that supported Manning. They have all now gotten into the Russiagate. All you have to do is look at Rachel Maddow. Rachel Maddow wrote a book against war back when it was Bush's war, and then she switched 180 degrees, and she's a good window into what's happened with a lot of people. They've just switched over because they're in a group and their leader tells them what to think.
Very, very sad. Thank you.
They're not libertarians. They are critical thinkers.
Yeah, how right you are, Coleen, once again. And our friend Douglas, I think, had a question for you, and he's going to step up and carefully walk his way up here in front of the camera that he has going and the mic. Okay.
Hi, Coleen. Just a quick question on Venezuela. Do you think that the United States should keep our nose out of the country for a while, or out of it entirely? And I was just watching on TV the other day that the government did take away the people's guns down there, and they have no way of fighting back. I was watching on Fox yesterday that there were tanks that were actually running into people on purpose. Thank you.
Yeah, our news is not doing a good job of telling the truth about Venezuela, because Pence, especially Pence, but Bolton and Abrams, they have had a long agenda. They've even been charged with Abrams has even been charged with felonies and everything else in the past. They have had a long time agenda of trying to topple governments in South America and Latin America, Central America. So they are pushing this, and they're going to continue to push it. At this point, unfortunately, they thought it would go quicker. It's kind of like the Iraq War. They thought it would be a cakewalk. If they pick a president and they say, you're the new president, we get 50 nations to say, you're the new president without any vote. This guy was not voted, and whether you like him or not, the Maduro president was voted. It was a fair election. There were election observers. It was fair. So here we have the country that claims to be the best democracy in the world, trying to topple governments all over, including now Venezuela. And now they have egg on their face because they thought they would be able to topple the government, that the military would quickly, go with the U.S., with the power, and they would be able to push Maduro out and put their boy Guaido in. It didn't work. And they've tried everything so far. And now Pompeo just said on the news tonight that they're looking at military intervention. So if they do military intervention, Russia, then the question is, what does Russia do? In Syria, it took a long time for Russia to react to what the United States was trying to do in toppling the Syrian government. But when they finally did react, then it turned into a very dangerous situation, because even if there's an accident and we have two countries that claim to be enemies, and we're both in there with planes and bombs, all it takes is somebody to a plane to go down. It could even be an accident, and we can start, something much, much worse. And so this is the most dangerous thing in the world to all of us, for the United States to be meddling in Venezuela. And Guaido, we'll have to see how it works out, but Pompeo is threatening military intervention right now. Everybody should be calling up their Congress and saying there should be a resolution in Congress saying no intervention in Venezuela, completely illegal. I don't know if the vote occurred today on Yemen, but there was supposed to be a vote to overturn Trump's veto of Congress. Congress, both House and the Senate, voted in a resolution for the United States to end its support, military support for Saudi Arabia's bombing of Yemen. Okay? That should be the Constitution. It's supposed to be end of it. But Trump vetoed it, and probably, I don't know exactly, but I really doubt that they were able, because it'll go strictly partisan, or mostly partisan, and so they probably were not able to overturn that. And the same thing could happen with Venezuela. Our Congress is just complete cowards when it comes to their constitutional responsibility to take responsibility for war. It can't be up president. James Madison said it can't be the president who gets to decide who goes to war, because presidents will always do this. They get a bump in the polls every time either Obama or Trump bombed, or Clinton for that matter, bombed somebody. They got a little bump in the polls because everybody thought, oh, us versus them, we're at war. They get all excited for a little while. And so presidents can't be in charge of this. It has to be Congress. And that's the problem with Venezuela. We have a cowardly Congress, and except for a few voices, again, Tulsi Gabbard is one of the people in the lead on that. And but the majority are just going along with it. In fact, there's bipartisan support for toppling the government of Venezuela right now. It's just that it's very difficult because the military is still siding with the president, Maduro. They lose their sovereignty as a country if they don't. If you're a Venezuelan and you topple your government, you lose your sovereignty.
All right. Coleen, I want to thank you very much. That was a wide-ranging discussion. You gave us a good action item that we have to go out and help convince people that if Assange is extradited and tried under these egregious conditions, it's bad for all of us as well as for the greater good. So we have our instructions. We will do that. I want to thank you again very much for speaking with us, and we look forward to chatting with you again sometime in the future. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for Coleen Rowley. Okay. See you next time.
Holly.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.